Harper Tate pressed her forehead to the cold wooden door of her rental cabin and released a frustrated groan. "No, no, no," she muttered, jiggling the handle again like the fifth time would magically work. It didn't. The key she'd been given was still tucked uselessly in her coat pocket because it didn't work. And of course her assistant was unreachable, her phone had no signal, and the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. Perfect. Just perfect. She stepped back, arms folded tightly over her chest, staring at the rustic cabin as if it had personally betrayed her. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away in the Rockies' no-board meetings. No emails. No one expecting her to save the company from another merger disaster. Just her fresh pine air and maybe a glass of wine in front of a fire. Instead, she was locked out, freezing and furious. A crunch of gravel behind her made her spin around. A tall man in a worn flannel shirt and jeans came walking up the drive, a toolbox in one hand, a little girl riding on his hip. "You okay there?" he called out, voice deep and warm, like the kind of voice that made you instinctively trust it. Harper straightened, brushing her coat down. "Are you the property manager?" "Nope." He adjusted the girl on his hip. She had wild curls and wide, curious eyes. "I'm the guy they send when city folks get locked out of cabins they don't know how to open." The little girl giggled. "My daddy fixes everything." The man grinned, and Harper caught herself staring a second too long. He had dark hair, sun-warmed skin, and those quiet eyes that felt like they saw more than you wanted them to. He looked like someone who built things with his hands and didn't care about stock prices or quarterly earnings. "I'm Harper," she said, stepping forward, holding out a hand. "Tate." He shifted his toolbox and shook her hand. His grasp was firm, warm. "Zane Walker. This is my daughter, Violet." "Say hi, Vi." "Hi," Violet beamed, then whispered, "You're pretty." Harper genuinely laughed for the first time all day. "Thanks, Violet, I needed that." Zane set Violet down gently and pulled a bent key ring from his pocket. "Let's see if we can get you inside before the bears show up." Harper's eyes widened. He grinned. "Kidding." "Kind of." In less than 5 minutes, Zane had the door open, using a master key and a trick involving the old lock she wouldn't have figured out in a million years. "You're a lifesaver," Harper breathed as the door creaked open and warmth spilled out. "Seriously." Zane tipped his head toward her as Violet dashed inside. "Just doing my job." She hesitated, then said, "Can I pay you for your time?" "Nope." He glanced at her, then added, "But I wouldn't say no to a cup of coffee. Vi and I were heading back when I got the call." Harper blinked. That wasn't the answer she expected. "You want to come in?" she asked slowly. Zane shrugged. "Up to you." Harper looked back at the cabin. She'd planned to spend the weekend alone, but something about the way Violet was already curled up on the couch, and the way Zane stood there like he wasn't expecting anything, made her say, "Yeah, sure. Come in." The inside of the cabin was rustic but beautiful stone fireplace, cozy leather chairs, a kitchen with exposed beams and copper pans. Harper flicked on the kettle while Violet explored. "You here for work or pleasure?" Zane asked, leaning against the counter. Harper glanced over her shoulder. "Neither, I guess. Escape." He nodded like he got it. "You from the city?" "New York. Figures." She narrowed her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Zane smiled. "Nothing bad, just—" "You look like someone used to having things under control." She crossed her arms. "I usually do." He held her gaze, and for a second, it felt like he saw past the designer coat and expensive boots. Like he saw the woman underneath, the one who hadn't slept in days, who was tired of fighting for every inch. "That coffee coming?" he asked, breaking the moment. Harper turned quickly. "Right." "Sorry." Over coffee, Violet told Harper all about her school, her favorite cartoon, and how her dad made the best pancakes in the world. Zane watched her with quiet pride, and Harper felt something stir in her chest she hadn't felt in a long time. Not attraction, though. Yes, the man was ridiculously handsome, but something deeper. A warmth. A quiet safety. When they finally stood to leave, Harper followed them to the door. "Thanks again," she said, holding it open. "You really saved me." Zane nodded. "You're welcome. If you need anything this weekend, I'm 15 minutes down the road." "Cabin with the red truck out front." "Got it." Violet waved. "Bye, Harper." Harper smiled. "Bye, Violet." And then they were gone. She closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding for a reason she didn't understand. He was just a handyman. A sweet, rugged, good-looking handyman with a daughter who made her laugh. That was it. Right? The next morning, a knock came just after 8. Harper opened the door to find Zane standing there with a paper bag and Violet holding a thermos. "We brought breakfast," he said. "Pancakes, real maple syrup. Figured you might want something better than granola." "This is unexpected," Harper said, stepping aside. "Violet insisted," Zane said. "She said you looked lonely." Violet nodded eagerly. "You can eat with us." And just like that, Harper's weekend alone turned into something else entirely. They ate at the big wooden table, syrup dripping and laughter echoing. Violet forgot her fork twice, and Zane told Harper about growing up in the mountains, about building homes after his wife passed away, about raising Violet with no backup plan but a lot of love. Harper didn't talk about being CEO of Tate Global. She didn't mention the millions in deals or the investors breathing down her neck. She just listened, smiled, laughed. Later, as Violet napped on the couch and Zane helped her carry wood in for the fire, Harper looked at him and asked, "Why'd you come back?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because you looked like someone who needed pancakes, and someone who might not realize how much she needed someone to talk to." Her throat tightened. "You don't know me." "No," he said quietly. "But I'd like to." And Harper, who hadn't let anyone in for years, found herself saying, "Okay." Just like that, something began. Neither of them knew it yet, but everything had just changed. Harper stood at the kitchen window, watching the early morning mist lift from the pine-lined valley below. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug Zane had left behind the day before he'd brought it with the pancakes, and she hadn't returned it yet. It was chipped near the rim and had the words Walker Construction fading across the side. She'd meant to wash it and drop it off later, but instead she'd kept refilling it, tracing the worn lettering with her thumb. She didn't understand why it mattered. She didn't understand a lot of things anymore. The person she was in Manhattan wouldn't have invited strangers into her rental cabin, wouldn't have laughed at a 6-year-old's pancake jokes, and certainly wouldn't have found herself thinking about a man whose idea of luxury was probably a fully stocked toolbox. But here she was. A knock came, softer than the one yesterday, and her pulse jumped. She told herself it wouldn't be him not 2 days in a row, but when she opened the door, there he was again. Zane, with snow in his hair and a bag slung over his shoulder. "I figured you might need these," he said, holding out a pair of snowshoes. "It's supposed to drop below freezing tonight. Trail's still clear now, but it gets slick fast." Harper blinked. "You just carry snowshoes around," he shrugged. "I was heading up to Peterson Ridge anyway." "Thought you might want to come," she hesitated. "You're inviting me on a hike." Zane looked at her steadily. "You said you came here to escape. Not sure how much escaping you're doing inside 4 walls. I didn't exactly pack for mountain climbing. You don't need to climb anything. It's mostly flat. I've got extra gear in the truck. Layers, gloves, boots, all clean." Harper should have said no. She had reports to skim, voicemails to ignore. A board member who was probably emailing her right now demanding an answer about the pending acquisition. But instead, she looked out at the pristine white trail leading into the woods and said, "Give me 10 minutes." When she stepped back onto the porch, bundled in borrowed thermal layers and a too large beanie, Zane gave her a once-over. "Boots fit." "Barely," she said, lifting a foot and wobbling. "But I'll survive." Violet wasn't with him this time. Harper didn't ask, but Zane offered anyway. "School," he said as they started down the trail. "She's got a winter program this week. Crafts, sledding, hot chocolate bribery. She loves it." They hiked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional gust of wind shaking frost from the branches above. Harper breathed in deep, the cold air burning in her chest in a way that felt strangely good. "You always live this far out?" she asked eventually. "Born here, left for a few years after college, came back when Violet was a baby, too many city noises. She slept better here." "Where's her mother?" Zane didn't flinch. "She passed when Violet was 3 months old. Complications they didn't catch in time." "I'm sorry," Harper said, quiet. "Yeah, me too." They didn't speak for a while after that. The air grew colder, but the sun was climbing, throwing gold across the snow. When they reached the ridge, Zane pointed to a fallen tree and gestured for her to sit. "You're not what I expected," he said, once they were settled. Harper pulled the beanie lower over her ears. "What did you expect? Someone who'd spend the weekend scrolling through emails and complaining about the Wi-Fi." "I almost did," she admitted. "But then you showed up with pancakes, and your kid told me I looked lonely." "She's not subtle. I like that about her." Zane studied her a moment. "You don't talk like someone on vacation." "Because I'm not," she said. "I told myself I came here to think, but I think I just wanted to run." "From what?" Harper glanced at the sky. "My company, my life, everything I built that doesn't feel like mine anymore." Zane leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So change it. It's not that simple." "Says who?" She looked at him, really looked. "What did you do before this?" "Carpentry, contracting, built houses mostly, big ones, for clients who never even stepped inside until the final walkthrough. I spent years making other people's dream homes while living in a trailer with a newborn. I know what it's like to build something that doesn't feel like yours." Harper's breath caught, "So I stopped," he continued. "Turned down the big jobs, started renovating cabins, fixing roofs. Stuff that mattered to the people living there. It doesn't pay as much, but Violet's got a yard now. We've got peace." She didn't answer, but something shifted in her chest. Not an epiphany, just a slow, quiet loosening of something she hadn't realized had gone tight. On the way back, Harper tripped on a patch of ice and would have gone down hard if Zane hadn't caught her by the arm. "You okay?" he asked, steadying her. She let out a breath. "Yeah, just off balance." His hand lingered a second longer than necessary. "You're not the only one." That night, she didn't sleep. She tried curled up in the thick quilt, staring at the ceiling beams, but her mind kept circling back to the way Zane had looked at her when he said that, like he wasn't just talking about the trail. The next morning, she drove to the edge of town and found the school Violet had mentioned. It was a low, cheerful building with a mural of mountains painted across the side. She didn't go in. She just sat in the car, watching kids spill out into the snow for recess. She didn't know what she was doing there. Then she saw Violet, laughing, chasing another child, coat flapping open as she ran. And behind her, standing near the fence with a coffee in hand, Zane. He spotted her before she could duck, and before she could decide whether to drive off, he was at her window. "You lost?" he asked, crouching slightly. Harper rolled it down. "I was curious." "About what?" "What it's like, your life." Zane looked at her for a long moment. "You want to find out." She didn't speak. "Come by the house later," he said. "We're making pizza. Violet insists on pineapple." Harper hesitated. "I don't want to confuse her." Zane's voice softened. "Then don't be a stranger." That evening, she stood on Zane's porch in the borrowed boots, holding a bottle of wine she'd picked up at the only store in town. It wasn't her usual vintage, and the label was crooked, but it felt right. Inside, Violet was already spreading sauce on dough with reckless abandon. Zane handed Harper an apron without comment, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she needed to explain herself. They ate on the floor beside the fireplace. Violet told them about her sled race, how she almost won before crashing into a snowbank. Zane laughed, stretched out beside the hearth, and Harper watched the way the firelight danced across his face. Later, when Violet fell asleep on the couch, Zane walked Harper to the door. "You're different here," he said. "I feel different." He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "What happens when you go back?" "I don't know," Zane nodded. "Well, just know this: nothing has to stay the same if it doesn't fit anymore." It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't even a question. But it was enough to make her step forward, just a little, until their hands touched. She didn't kiss him. But she didn't walk away either. Snow fell in slow, silent flakes as Harper stepped out of her cabin the next morning, bundled in the coat she hadn't worn since her last business trip to Zurich. It felt heavier here. Not from the weight, but from the quiet that blanketed the mountains in a way no city ever could. She locked the door behind her and followed the narrow trail Zane had mentioned, one that led toward the small lake he said froze over in winter and shimmered like glass in the early light. She needed time to think, away from her phone, away from the pressure she'd carried like armor for years. Last night's dinner still lingered in her chest, not the pizza, but the ease of it. The way Violet had leaned against her during the movie, the way Zane had watched them both like they were something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. She hadn't realized it either. The lake came into view, half frozen, with edges softening under the mid-morning sun. She stood at the edge and stared at her reflection in the thin ice, this version of herself without heels, without titles, without the mask she wore in every boardroom. Footsteps crunched behind her. "I thought I might find you here," Zane said, his voice calm as the still water stretched before them. "I didn't expect you," Harper replied, not turning around. "I figured you'd want space. But I also figured you might not want all of it." She looked at him then, noticing the thermos in his hand. He extended it without a word. "Ginger tea helps with the cold." She took it, letting the steam warm her face. "I used to think silence was uncomfortable," she said after a moment. "Now I think it's just honest." Zane crouched near the water. "Some people fill silence because they're afraid of what they'll hear if they don't. Is that what you think I'm doing?" "No, I think you're finally listening." She sat beside him, careful not to touch his arm. "I got a call from my CFO this morning," she said. "I didn't answer. First time I've ignored one of his calls in 6 years. Zane didn't react. He just waited. "They're pushing to finalize a deal I don't believe in anymore. I've fought it for months. But now I wonder if I was fighting just to prove I could win." "What happens if you walk away?" Harper laughed, dry and brittle. "I lose everything I built. Or maybe," he said, "you finally start building something that matters." She stared at him. "You say it like it's that simple. It's not, but that doesn't make it wrong." They sat in silence again, the kind that settled instead of stung. Zane eventually stood. "Come by the workshop later. Violet's making a birdhouse. She wants you to paint it with her. She asked for me. She thinks you're interesting." "That's one word for it." Zane's eyes held hers. "It's not the one I'd use." He walked off without waiting for a reply, leaving her holding the thermos and her breath. Later, Harper arrived at the workshop. It was connected to a wide red barn on their property, with an open garage door and a scattering of tools along the back wall. Inside, Violet was kneeling on a stool, paintbrush in hand, tongue poking out in concentration as she dabbed blue paint onto a crooked little birdhouse. When she saw Harper, she lit up. "I saved you the roof," Harper laughed. "The roof. That's the best part." Zane glanced up from where he was cutting a plank of wood. "She said only someone important should do it." Violet nodded. "Birds need strong roofs, in case it rains." Harper took the brush with a mock-serious nod. "Then I better not mess it up." They worked in companionable chaos for an hour, Harper carefully painting the roof a deep violet, Violet adding glitter where it didn't belong, and Zane building another frame in the corner, stealing glances when he thought she wouldn't notice. But she noticed. When Violet wandered off to chase the cat that had wandered in from the barn, Harper leaned against the table. "She's good for me," she said. "Violet," Zane set down his drill. "I think you're good for her too. I don't know how to be around kids. I never planned for them. Never made time. That doesn't mean you can't now." Harper looked down at her hands. "I don't even know how to live without a 5-year plan. Maybe it's time for a day-by-day plan instead." She turned to him slowly. "You keep saying these things like you believe they're possible." "I believe in second chances," he said. "I believe in people who don't know they're lost until they're found." Her throat tightened. "I'm flying back tomorrow," I figured. "I shouldn't have stayed this long." "Maybe not," Zane said, "but I'm glad you did." She didn't speak for a moment. "Then, if I walk away from everything, I don't know what's left of me." "Maybe," Zane said gently, "there's more of you waiting to be found." That night, Harper returned to her cabin and sat in the dark. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she opened her laptop and stared at the blinking cursor of an email draft that had been sitting unsent for 3 days. The subject line read, "My resignation." Her hand hovered over the keyboard. Then she closed the laptop and picked up her phone. She didn't call her CFO. She called her assistant. "Can you clear my schedule for the next week?" she asked. There was a pause. "Are you okay?" "I think I'm finally getting there." The next morning, she stood on Zane's porch, suitcase in hand. "I thought you were flying out today," he said, meeting her at the door. "I changed my flight." "For how long?" "A few more days." He stepped aside, letting her in. "Violet will be thrilled. And you," Zane met her eyes. I haven't stopped thinking about you since you got locked out of that cabin. I was a mess. You still are. But you're my kind of mess. She smiled, her chest aching in a way that felt like healing. I don't know what this is yet. Then let's figure it out. That night, they sat on the porch wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars blink above the trees. Violet was asleep inside, and for once, Harper didn't feel like she was running out of time. She felt like she was finally arriving. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the open windows of Zane's house as Harper tied Violet's shoelaces on the front steps. The little girl had insisted on wearing 2 different socks, and Harper, still adjusting to the rhythm of mountain life, had learned to pick her battles. "You'll help me finish the birdhouse tomorrow, right?" Violet asked, bouncing in place. "If you don't add more glitter before I get there," Harper said, giving her a look. "No promises," Violet giggled, then ran toward the school bus that had just pulled up at the end of the long gravel drive. Harper stood and brushed her hands on her jeans, still not used to the way the fabric moved on her. There was something liberating about not wearing a blazer, something honest. Zane came out behind her, adjusting the collar of his flannel shirt. "Thanks for taking her out this morning." "She gets wild when she's excited." "I noticed," Harper said, watching as Violet climbed into the bus with a wave. "She told me I should move into the cabin next door." Zane leaned against the porch post. "It's not a bad idea. I thought it was just a shed. I could turn it into something else." Harper looked at him, half amused, half wary. "You offering to build me a house now? I'm offering to build you a place to land," Zane said, straightforward as always. "If you want it." She didn't answer, not yet. There were still things she hadn't said, questions she hadn't asked, and something inside her needed to make sure this wasn't just a borrowed life, something that would vanish the second she stepped back into the boardroom. "Walk with me," she said instead. They took the long trail that curved behind the barn and climbed a gentle slope to a clearing that overlooked the valley. Snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing the rust-colored earth beneath. The sky was wide and pale blue, and for a long stretch they didn't speak. "I called my lawyer this morning," Harper said at last. "Told him to finalize the dissolution of my shares." Zane didn't stop walking, but he glanced at her. "You sure?" "Yes," he waited. "I spent years building a company that looked good on paper, but it stopped meaning anything, and I kept it alive out of pride, not purpose." Zane picked up a small stone from the ground and tossed it into the woods. "Letting go of something doesn't mean it was a mistake. I know." She brushed her fingers along the edge of her coat. "I used to think success meant proving I could do it all, that I didn't need anyone, but I do. I want roots. I want people who see me when I'm not performing." Zane stopped then. "Turn to face her. I see you." Harper's gaze locked with his. "And I see you, but I need to know this isn't just a temporary spark. I'm not someone who does halfway." "I don't want halfway either," he said. "I've built a life that's small but solid. I didn't expect you to walk into it and fit. But somehow you do." She stepped closer, her voice lower. "What if I'm scared?" Zane reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "Then we'll do it scared." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged but quiet. Then he kissed her, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the steady assurance of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. When they broke apart, Harper whispered, "That was overdue." Zane smiled, but it wasn't teasing. "Yeah." It was. They walked back slowly, hands brushing now and then, until Harper's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She hesitated, then pulled it out. "Is it work?" Zane asked. She looked at the screen and shook her head. "It's a friend. She's asking if I'm coming back to the city." "What are you going to tell her?" Harper thought for a moment, then typed a reply and put the phone away. "I said I'm not sure, but I know where I'm staying for now." Zane didn't press for more. That afternoon, Harper drove into town to meet with a local realtor. Not to buy, not yet, but to understand the lay of the land. She found herself drawn to the idea of permanence, of investing in something real. A small business had recently gone up for sale, a bookstore and cafe in the heart of the main street. The owner was retiring, and the listing had been sitting untouched for months. She stepped inside, inhaling the scent of old paper and cinnamon. The shelves were uneven, the counter creaked when she leaned on it, and there was a handwritten sign that read, "Back in 5 or whenever I feel like it." It was imperfect, charming, human. She left with a business card and a key to view the upstairs apartment. That evening, Harper arrived at Zane's house with a folder in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "I have something to show you," she said. Setting the folder on the kitchen table as Violet colored at the far end, Zane opened it, flipping through the pages. "Is this the bookstore down by the courthouse? It could be more than a bookstore. The apartment upstairs has a view of the square, and the kitchen is big enough to bake in." Zane looked up. "You thinking about staying?" "I'm thinking about starting." He didn't say anything for a moment, then closed the folder and walked around the table to her. "If you do this, it's not going to be easy." "I don't want easy. You'll have to learn how to shovel snow. I'll buy a good coat." He reached for her hand. "You really mean it?" "I do." Violet looked up from her drawing. "Does this mean Harper lives here now?" Zane and Harper exchanged a glance. Harper crouched beside her. "It means I'll be around a lot more, if that's okay with you." Violet grinned. "Only if you still help with glitter." "I can do that." They spent the rest of the night sprawled on the living room rug, Harper reading aloud from one of Violet's books while Zane built a fire. Later, when Violet had been tucked in and the house had gone quiet, Harper stood at the back door and looked out over the yard. "I never thought I'd find this here," she said softly. Zane came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Sometimes the best things aren't found." "They're built," she leaned into him. "Then let's build it." The next morning, she woke in his bed, sunlight pouring through the windows, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of expectation pressing her into the mattress. She felt light, open. At breakfast, Violet announced she wanted Harper to help her build a lemonade stand in the spring. Zane offered to draw up blueprints, and Harper agreed to design the logo. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. By the end of the week, Harper had placed a bid on the bookstore and was arranging for a shipment of her favorite titles to be delivered. She'd called her former assistant and offered her a job managing the back-end logistics remotely at half the stress and double the creative freedom. She'd said yes. 1 month later, Harper opened the doors to the newly renamed Evergreen Books and Brews, serving locally roasted coffee and curated novels to a line of curious townsfolk. Zane built the counter himself. Violet stocked the children's corner with her favorite stories. And on the first Saturday of spring, Harper stood outside the bookstore in a soft linen dress, sunlight on her face, as Zane took her hand and dropped to one knee in front of the entire town. "I didn't expect to find love out here," he said. "But you walked into our lives and made everything sharper, truer. I don't want a life that doesn't have you in it. Will you marry me?" Harper looked down at the man who had opened a door, brought her pancakes, and somehow cracked open the armor she'd worn for a decade. "Yes," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Cheers erupted from the crowd. Violet jumped up and down, hugging Harper's leg. Zane stood and kissed her, right there on the sidewalk, with flower petals drifting down from the second-story window where someone had tossed them in celebration. In the months that followed, Harper never once missed the boardroom. She had a bookstore, a new business, a daughter who wasn't hers by blood but loved her just the same, and a man who never asked her to be anything but herself. She'd gotten locked out of a cabin, and in the end, she'd found the key to everything else. The first rain of spring came in the early hours of the morning, soft and steady against the roof of the bookstore's upstairs apartment. Harper woke to the sound of it, and the gentle rhythm of Zane's breathing beside her. His hand rested at the curve of her waist, warm and grounding, as if even in sleep he knew she was still getting used to the stillness. She turned slightly, watching the light shift slowly across the wooden floorboards. The apartment wasn't large, but it was full of life, freshly potted herbs on the windowsill, a half-finished puzzle on the kitchen table, Violet's art pinned to the fridge with magnets shaped like little birds. Harper hadn't known a life like this existed. Not just the quiet, but the belonging. Zane stirred beside her, his voice rough with sleep. "You're awake early." "I couldn't sleep," she said, brushing her fingers through his hair. "Rain woke me." He slid his hand over hers, eyes still closed. "Still not used to being here. I think I'm just not used to being still." Zane opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "You've been running for a long time. It's okay if it takes a while to stop." Harper exhaled, letting herself settle against him. I don't want to run anymore. You're not, he said. You're finally home. Later that morning, they made pancakes Violet's favorite, with blueberries and cinnamon, and Harper let her stir even though it turned the batter into a volcanic mess. Zane flipped them one-handed while pretending to fend off Violet's flour attacks. Harper laughed more than she had in years, and when Violet insisted they eat by the fire even though it wasn't cold, neither of them argued. After breakfast, Zane took Violet to visit his sister, who lived a few towns over and had promised a day of crafts and movies. Harper stayed behind to prepare for the bookstore's spring reading event, something she'd planned with the help of a few locals who had quickly become friends. She rearranged the front tables, set out the new shipment of poetry books, and placed fresh tulips in a mason jar by the register. The community had embraced her in a way she hadn't expected. They stopped by not just for coffee or books, but to talk, to ask about her life before, to share pieces of their own. As she was pinning the final sign for the event, the door opened and Laura Peterson stepped inside. She was in her 60s, the former owner of the bookstore and the one who'd sold it to Harper with a knowing smile and a quiet, "You'll do more with it than I ever could." Laura held up a small wrapped box. "I thought you might like this." Found it in one of the old storage bins upstairs. Harper accepted it cautiously, unwrapping the faded paper to reveal a delicate key pendant on a silver chain. The metal was old, slightly tarnished, but beautiful in its simplicity. "It belonged to my grandmother," Laura said. "She used to say every woman needs a reminder that she holds the key to her own life." Harper swallowed. "Thank you, that means more than I can say." Laura gave her a soft look. "You're exactly where you're meant to be, Harper." Don't doubt that. The reading event that afternoon drew in more people than she'd expected. Children curled up on bright cushions in the reading corner while Harper read aloud from a classic adventure novel. Parents sipped coffee and browsed the new table of spring releases. A high school student stood at the poetry shelf, flipping through pages with wide-eyed wonder. Zane returned just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, Violet asleep in his arms, her shoes dangling from his fingertips. "You missed a crowd," Harper whispered, taking Violet from him. "I'd rather come back to this," he said, brushing a kiss to Harper's temple. "You looked like you belonged up there reading to those kids." "She drooled on my shoulder," Harper whispered, gesturing to Violet. Zane grinned. "That's her way of saying she loves you." They tucked Violet into the dabed upstairs, layering blankets over her as the rain returned, soft and steady against the window panes. Harper stood by the glass, watching the lights of the town shimmer below. Zane came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I've been working on something," he said. "Something I want to show you." She turned. Now he nodded. "Come on." They stepped out into the rain, Harper barefoot and laughing as the drops soaked through her sweater. Zane led her around the side of the bookstore, past the garden beds she'd started planting, to the old shed that had once been used for storage. He opened the door and flipped on the light. Inside, the space had been transformed. Wooden beams framed the ceiling and freshly sanded shelves lined the walls. A long work table stood in the center, with art supplies, books, and a child-sized stool placed beside a taller chair. Harper stepped inside, stunned. "What is this?" Zane rested his hand on the edge of the table. "It's for you and Violet. A place to create, to write, to think. I figured if you were going to stay, you'd need more than just a bookstore. You'd need a space that was yours." She turned toward him, heart full. "You built all this, every inch." "Why?" Zane stepped closer, brushing wet hair from her face. "Because I love you, because you walked into my life and changed everything, because you made us a family." Tears blurred her vision. "Zane, I'm not good at speeches. I didn't plan this. But I know one thing I want every day with you. The boring ones, the loud ones, the rainy ones like this. I want all of it." Harper reached for him, pulling him close as the rain tapped the roof above them. "I love you too. More than I ever thought I could love anything that wasn't built on ambition or success." He rested his forehead against hers. "So stay. Build this with me." "I already am." They kissed there in the workshop, rain falling like a curtain around them, the world narrowing to the warmth between their palms and the quiet certainty that nothing else mattered as long as they had this. The seasons turned. Violet started first grade in the fall, proud of the new backpack Harper helped her pick. Zane expanded his contracting business, choosing only the jobs that made him feel good, often local, often for people who couldn't afford to pay much but needed help. Harper's bookstore became a community staple, hosting author nights, youth writing workshops, and a now famous Sunday brunch with homemade scones. They married under the arch of the old pine trees behind the bookstore, with lanterns hanging from the branches and the entire town in attendance. Violet carried the rings on a velvet pillow and declared herself officially the boss of both of them now. There was laughter, tears, and a dance floor made of worn barnwood that Zane laid by hand. Harper wore a dress simple and soft, her feet bare, her heart entirely full. They didn't honeymoon in Paris or the Maldives. They spent a week in a nearby cabin by the lake, the same one Harper had first been locked out of. This time, she had the key, years past. Harper published a book of her own, a collection of essays and letters about finding home in unexpected places. It became a quiet bestseller. She dedicated it to Zane and Violet, who showed me how to stop running. Violet grew into a curious, spirited teenager who loved painting, poetry, and helping her parents around the bookstore. She never stopped calling Harper her other mom, and Harper never stopped feeling her chest swell at the sound. The workshop behind the bookstore bloomed with life: Harper's journals, Zane's sketches, Violet's art. They filled the space with color and memory, the walls a reflection of 3 lives intertwined. Nothing was perfect. There were arguments about dishes, late nights with sick kids, and winters that dragged on too long. But there was also a love that never wavered, a bond that had been forged not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday choosing of one another. Harper had once believed love was something sacrificed for success. Now she knew it was the foundation of everything she'd ever truly wanted. And every morning, when she woke to the sound of Zane's breath beside her and Violet's sleepy footsteps padding down the stairs, she knew without a doubt she was exactly where she was meant to be.